The Yakuza thought they could take down Chuck Norris, but within seconds, things didn't go according to plan. They were confident in their abilities, but they didn't know who they were messing with. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and post in the comments where you're watching from. Chuck Norris had always been a man in motion. Even after stepping away from the Hollywood spotlight, he never stopped moving. His days were spent training, teaching, and giving back to the martial arts community. His foundation helped underprivileged kids learn discipline through karate, and he often traveled between cities to support charity events and training camps. Though he no longer sought out the limelight, it still found him from time to time. People recognized him wherever he went, whether in a quiet diner or a crowded airport. But fame had never been his goal. He had built his life around discipline, respect, and an unwavering sense of justice. It was those principles that had carried him through every challenge, on and off the screen. And perhaps it was those very same principles that had now put him in someone's crosshairs. The call came late in the evening, just as he was finishing his daily workout in his personal gym. The voice on the other end of the line was one he hadn't heard in years, gravelly, worn with age and experience, but still carrying the same edge of authority. It belonged to an old friend, a former intelligence operative who had helped Chuck with security matters in the past. He wasn't the kind of man to call just for a chat. "Chuck," the voice said, calm but deliberate, "you're being watched." Chuck wiped the sweat from his forehead with a towel and glanced at the phone, as if trying to read the man's face through the static silence. He said nothing, waiting for the explanation that would follow. Japanese organized crime, the Yakuza. I don't know what you did to piss them off, but they've taken an interest in you. My sources say they've been running surveillance on you for at least 2 weeks. This isn't some tabloid trash looking for a headline. This is serious. Chuck frowned slightly. He had spent decades dealing with different kinds of people, some good, some bad, but he had never knowingly crossed paths with the Yakuza. He had been to Japan many times, had trained with some of the greatest martial artists the country had ever produced. He had respect for their traditions, for the discipline their culture embodied. But the Yakuza weren't about honor. They were criminals, businessmen who dealt in violence, drugs, extortion, and fear. And now, for some reason, they were watching him. "Any idea why?" Chuck finally asked. The man on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's speculation. Someone in their ranks believes you interfered with something, maybe not directly, but enough to put your name on their list. It could be an old connection from your film days or something more recent. Regardless, I'd take this seriously." Chuck wasn't one to panic. He had been in enough real-life fights to know that fear never helped a man, but he also wasn't naive. The Yakuza didn't waste time with empty threats. If they had decided he was a problem, they would act on it. And he needed to be ready. He ended the call and set the phone down on the counter. He walked over to the window and looked out into the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. They weren't coming for him yet, but they would. And when they did, they would find out that he wasn't an easy target. The next morning, Chuck started noticing things he hadn't paid attention to before. A black Toyota Crown parked across the street from his training center. A pair of men in expensive suits sitting at the far end of the cafe where he had his morning coffee. A figure lingering near his car in the grocery store parking lot, just long enough to be suspicious. At first, he thought it might be paranoia creeping in after the phone call, but the signs were too consistent to ignore. These weren't fans. These weren't reporters. They were watching him. He tested them. On his way home from training, he took an alternate route, making unexpected turns, slowing down at green lights just to see who reacted. The same black Toyota appeared in his rearview mirror at least twice, keeping its distance but never truly disappearing. At the gym, he had one of his students take a fake emergency call in the middle of practice, causing Chuck to leave suddenly. As he stepped outside, he saw two of the suited men from the cafe leaning against a lamppost across the street, as if they had just been waiting for him. Chuck had spent his life training for situations like this. Combat wasn't just about throwing punches. It was about awareness, understanding your environment, reading people. Whoever these men were, they were professionals. They weren't sloppy, they weren't reckless. They were testing the waters, waiting to see what he would do. That night, he returned home to find something had changed. Nothing obvious at first glance, but as he stepped inside, he could feel it. The air was different. He walked through his house, scanning every detail. A chair was slightly out of place. His books, usually lined up neatly on the shelf, had a small gap where one had been removed and replaced. The drawer to his desk was closed but not fully latched. Someone had been inside. Chuck didn't bother calling the police. Whoever had done this was too good to leave evidence. This wasn't about robbery. This was a message. They wanted him to know that they could reach him, that they could come and go as they pleased. It was a warning. The final confirmation came in the form of a business card left on the kitchen counter. It was simple, black, with a single Japanese kanji symbol in silver foil pressed into the paper. He recognized it instantly. It was the mark of a Yakuza clan. Chuck stared at the card for a long moment, then set it down carefully. He understood the game now. They wanted him to be afraid, to feel the invisible hand closing around him, but fear wasn't something he allowed himself. If they wanted to play, then he would play, but he wouldn't be the one on the defensive. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the darkness waiting. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. The Yakuza thought they were hunting him. They had no idea what they had just started. The sun was barely rising over the horizon when Chuck Norris stepped outside his home. The air was crisp, the early morning stillness undisturbed except for the distant sound of a car engine idling somewhere down the street. He could feel the eyes on him. They had been there for days now, watching, waiting. The Yakuza weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. They wanted him to feel their gaze, to know that they were closing in. But if they thought intimidation would work, they had chosen the wrong man. He moved through his usual morning routine as if nothing was out of the ordinary. A 5-mile run through the quiet streets, shadowboxing drills in his private gym, then an hour of strength training. If they were watching, let them watch. Let them see what he was capable of. Every movement was a message. He was not afraid. He was ready. By the time he arrived at his favorite cafe, the streets were beginning to wake up. He parked his truck a block away and walked the rest of the distance, scanning his surroundings without making it obvious. As expected, they were there. 2 men in dark suits sat at a corner table near the window, nursing cups of black coffee but barely touching them. Their hair was perfectly slicked back, their hands clean, unscarred. They weren't local thugs. They were professionals, sent by men who did not tolerate failure. Chuck ordered his coffee, took his seat at the counter, and pretended not to notice them. He listened instead. Years of training had taught him that people revealed more through body language than words. The way they glanced at him in short, precise intervals. The way their posture remained unnaturally straight, as if expecting something at any moment. The way one of them tapped his fingers against the ceramic cup in a steady rhythm, an unconscious sign of impatience. They weren't here to attack, not yet. They were still in the observation stage. He finished his coffee, left cash on the counter, and walked out without looking back. They wouldn't follow him immediately. They were smarter than that. Instead, they would wait, give him a false sense of security. But he was already ahead of them. By midday, the surveillance had escalated. The same black Toyota Crown that had been lingering near his house was now parked across from his training center. The men inside made no effort to hide. They wanted him to know they were there. Chuck stepped outside and stretched, pretending to check his phone as he casually glanced their way. 2 men in the front seat, another in the back. None of them moved. A test. Chuck turned his back and walked inside, giving them nothing. They would have to make the next move. It came that night. The air was heavy with the scent of approaching rain as Chuck left the gym late in the evening. Most of his students had already gone home. Only a few cars remained in the lot. As he locked up the doors, he noticed them. 3 figures standing near the alley beside the building, just outside the reach of the streetlights. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. He stepped forward, his movements calm, measured. The nearest figure moved first, a tall man in a black leather jacket with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He took a slow drag before flicking it onto the pavement. A second man shifted his weight, cracking his knuckles as he stepped closer. The third remained still, watching. Chuck stopped a few feet away. The silence stretched between them. Then the first man lunged. It was sloppy. A wide, looping punch meant more for intimidation than impact. Chuck barely had to move. He slipped to the side, caught the man's wrist, and twisted sharply. A grunt of pain followed, then the dull thud of a body hitting the pavement as Chuck kicked the attacker's legs out from under him. The second man was faster. He came in low, aiming for Chuck's ribs with a quick jab, but Chuck was already moving, redirecting the strike with his forearm before delivering a short, brutal elbow to the man's sternum. The attacker staggered back, clutching his chest. The third man didn't attack immediately. He was smarter, more experienced. He reached into his coat. Chuck saw the movement before it was finished. A blade flashed in the dim light, a small but deadly tanto knife. Chuck reacted instantly. He closed the distance in a blink, grabbing the man's wrist before the knife could be brought to full extension. A sharp twist, a precise application of pressure, and the knife clattered to the ground. The fight was over before it had truly begun. The 3 men lay groaning on the pavement, one clutching his wrist, another gasping for breath. Chuck didn't need to ask who they were with. He already knew. He stepped over the fallen knife, leaving it where it lay. There was no need to take it. He had sent the message he wanted to send. They had underestimated him. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The following morning, Chuck met with his old friend, the former intelligence operative who had warned him about the Yakuza's interest. They sat in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. His friend listened without interruption as Chuck recounted the events of the past 24 hours. When he was finished, the man exhaled slowly and shook his head. "This is only the beginning," he said. Chuck already knew that. The Yakuza weren't like common street gangs. They didn't forget. They didn't forgive. They adapted. If their first test had failed, they would escalate. That was their way. His friend gave him a name, a man in the city who operated as the Yakuza's stateside enforcer. He wasn't the top boss, but he was the one who handled problems. Chuck was now a problem. He left the diner with a decision made. If they thought he would run, they were wrong. He wouldn't wait for the next attack. He would take the fight to them. Chuck drove for hours, the hum of the engine a steady companion beneath the endless stretch of highway. The city lights had faded in his rearview mirror long ago, replaced by the quiet solitude of open road and darkened fields. He wasn't running. That wasn't in his nature. But he wasn't about to let the Yakuza dictate the rules of engagement either. If they wanted him off balance, constantly looking over his shoulder, they would be disappointed. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to change the battlefield entirely. He had a speaking engagement in a neighboring city, a small gathering to support a youth martial arts foundation. It was the kind of event he enjoyed, talking to young fighters, inspiring them, sharing what he had learned over decades of training and discipline. The Yakuza wouldn't expect him to leave town so soon, and if they were watching, they would have to scramble to catch up. That was what he wanted. The rain had started by the time he reached the outskirts of the city. A slow drizzle at first, building into a steady curtain of water that slicked the roads and distorted the glow of passing headlights. He pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel, the kind of place that had seen better days but still offered a clean bed and 4 walls. He didn't need luxury. He needed a place where no one would expect him to be. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as he checked in. An old television murmured in the background, flickering with the dull glow of a late-night talk show. Chuck took his key, thanked the man, and made his way to the far end of the motel where his room waited. The rain drummed lightly against the metal railing as he walked, his boots silent against the concrete. He entered the room without hesitation, locking the door behind him. The layout was typical. 2 beds, a small desk, a television bolted to the wall. He flicked on the light and set his bag down, his instincts already at work. He checked the window first, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the parking lot below. A few scattered cars. Nothing unusual. But that didn't mean he was alone. Years of training had ingrained certain habits into him. He walked the perimeter of the room, checking for anything out of place. The closet was empty. The bathroom, too. He pulled the chair from the desk and propped it under the doorknob, not because he needed it, but because it would give him an extra second if someone tried to force their way in. Then he waited. The first knock came just past midnight. Soft at first, a polite, almost hesitant tap against the door. Then again, harder this time. Chuck didn't move. He had felt something was off the moment he stepped into this place, and now he knew why. He reached for his phone, turned the screen toward the mirror on the wall, angling it so he could see the reflection of the peephole. A simple trick, but an effective one. 3 men. They were dressed the same way as the others had been. Black suits, pressed shirts, their posture too rigid, too rehearsed. One of them had his hands in his pockets, but Chuck could tell from the way his shoulders were set that he was gripping something inside. A weapon, most likely a knife. Another stood slightly back, keeping his eyes on the parking lot, watching for anyone who might pass by. The third was the one knocking. They weren't guests. The knock came again, more insistent. Chuck didn't answer. A beat of silence. Then, without warning, the door frame splintered as a boot slammed against it. The chair bracing the door held for half a second before toppling over, but by then, Chuck was already moving. The first man burst into the room, leading with his shoulder, expecting to catch Chuck off guard. Instead, he was met with a fist to the ribs that sent him staggering sideways. Chuck caught him by the arm, twisted sharply, and drove him headfirst into the motel dresser. The second man lunged from the side, but Chuck sidestepped, using the momentum against him. A quick sweep sent the attacker crashing to the floor, and before he could rise, Chuck delivered a precise strike to the temple, knocking him out cold. The third man was the one to watch. He hadn't rushed in blindly like the others. He stood in the doorway now, a sleek, black-handled knife glinting in his grip. His stance was steady, controlled, a professional. Chuck exhaled slowly. The man moved first, slashing in a fast, controlled arc. Chuck stepped back, the blade missing him by inches. Another slash followed, this one lower, aimed at his midsection. He pivoted, catching the attacker's wrist with a firm grip, twisting just enough to disrupt his balance. The knife clattered to the floor. The attacker barely had time to react before Chuck struck. One sharp elbow to the sternum, a second to the jaw. The man's head snapped back, and he crumpled without another sound. The room was silent again, except for the muffled sound of rain outside. Chuck took a slow breath, surveying the scene. 3 men, all down. Not dead, but they wouldn't be moving any time soon. Then he saw it. The third man, the one with the knife, had something tucked inside his jacket, a piece of paper neatly folded. Chuck pulled it free and opened it. A single line of kanji written in deep red ink. An address. A challenge. They had expected him to be here. They had sent these men not just to kill him, but to test him, to see if he was worth the trouble. And now they had left him an invitation. He let the paper fall to the floor and stepped over the unconscious bodies. This wasn't just about watching anymore. The Yakuza were ready for him. And now he was ready for them. Chuck Norris didn't waste time. The moment he saw the address on the slip of paper, he knew what had to be done. The Yakuza were no longer testing him. They had sent an invitation, daring him to step into their world. They expected him to hesitate, to retreat, to wait for their next move. But they didn't know him. He had no intention of waiting. If they thought they had the upper hand, it was time to prove them wrong. He left the motel before dawn, moving through the parking lot with the same careful awareness that had kept him alive for decades. No sign of additional surveillance, but that meant little. The Yakuza didn't need to keep watching. They knew where he would go next. They wanted him to come to them. The drive to the address took him to the docks on the outskirts of the city, an industrial district where warehouses stretched along the waterfront. Their metal siding rusted from years of exposure to the salt air. He killed the engine half a mile from the location and continued on foot, slipping through the shadows of stacked shipping containers. The place was active even at this hour. Freight trucks rumbled along the main road, the occasional worker moved between warehouses, but Chuck wasn't here for the legitimate business. He was looking for the Yakuza's operation, and it wouldn't be out in the open. He found it near the far end of the dock, an old warehouse with no signage, no markings, but with a handful of men stationed near the entrance. They weren't dock workers. The way they stood, the way their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, their hands always within reach of concealed weapons, these were enforcers. Men whose job wasn't moving cargo but making sure no one asked the wrong questions. Chuck observed for a few minutes, noting the patterns of movement. 2 guards outside the front entrance, another one stationed at the loading dock. 2 more near a parked car, speaking quietly, exchanging cigarettes. 5 men total that he could see. there would be more inside. He moved with precision, staying in the shadows, using the sound of the wind and the distant machinery to mask his steps. The first guard at the loading dock barely had time to register movement before Chuck struck. One swift motion, a precise strike to the side of the neck, cutting off blood flow to the brain. The man crumpled before he could make a sound. The two near the car didn't notice anything until it was too late. Chuck closed the distance quickly, catching the first one by the collar and slamming him into the side of the vehicle. The other reached for something inside his coat, but Chuck grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply until the weapon, a small pistol, clattered to the pavement. A quick strike to the jaw sent the man sprawling. 3 down. The two at the front entrance were the real problem. Unlike the others, they were already on alert, noticing the absence of their companions. One of them spoke into a radio clipped to his jacket, his other hand resting on the handle of a blade sheathed at his hip. Chuck moved fast. He grabbed a discarded metal pipe from the ground and hurled it toward the opposite side of the lot. The sudden clatter against the concrete made both guards turn instinctively, just for a split second. That was all he needed. By the time they realized their mistake, Chuck was already upon them. He took the first one down with a clean kick to the knee, snapping the joint in a direction it was never meant to go. The man went down screaming, but the sound was cut short when Chuck's fist met his temple. The second guard managed to draw his knife, but he never got to use it. Chuck caught his wrist mid-swing, forced his own momentum against him, and sent him crashing head first into the warehouse door. The way was clear. Chuck pressed his back against the metal siding and listened. Inside, he could hear voices, the low murmur of men speaking in Japanese. A radio crackled somewhere deeper in the building. Someone inside was still expecting a check-in from the guards. He didn't have much time before they realized something was wrong. He slipped inside, moving through the dimly lit corridors stacked high with crates. The air smelled of oil and salt water, mixing with the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. He could hear them before he saw them. 3 men gathered near the center of the warehouse, discussing something over an open case of weapons. Chuck wasted no movement. He struck first, taking down the closest man before the others even registered his presence. The second reached for his gun, but Chuck closed the distance too fast, knocking the weapon aside and driving his elbow into the man's sternum. The third tried to run. He didn't make it to the door before Chuck caught him, pulling him back and slamming him into a stack of crates. Silence settled over the room. He moved deeper into the warehouse, past rows of stacked boxes marked with shipping labels in Japanese. Contraband, most likely. Smuggled goods. This wasn't just a meeting place. It was a full operation. The Yakuza had been using this dock for more than just intimidation tactics. Then he found what he was looking for. At the far end of the warehouse, seated behind a desk covered in scattered paperwork and cigarette butts, was a man Chuck immediately recognized from the information his friend had given him. The enforcer. The man in charge of the Yakuza's local operations. The man didn't look surprised to see him. He exhaled a slow stream of smoke from his cigarette and flicked the ashes aside. Chuck had been expecting a fight, but the man simply nodded, as if he had already accepted the outcome of this meeting. "You came," he said in heavily accented English. Chuck didn't answer. He wasn't here to talk. The man nodded again, pushing back from the desk and rising to his feet. Unlike the others, he wasn't reaching for a weapon. His posture was relaxed, but Chuck could see it in his stance. He was a fighter. Not a man who relied on intimidation or numbers, but someone who had been in real fights, who had taken hits and given them back tenfold. This wasn't going to be an ambush. This was a test. The enforcer stepped around the desk, rolling his shoulders, loosening his wrists. He wasn't stalling. He was preparing. Chuck met his gaze, unshaken, unyielding. The real fight was about to begin. The enforcer didn't rush. He was calm, controlled, the kind of man who had been in enough fights to know that the first move often decided everything. Chuck recognized that kind of confidence. It wasn't bravado, not the arrogance of a man who relied on others to do his dirty work. This was a man who had earned his reputation with his own fists. They circled each other in the dim light of the warehouse, the only sounds of the distant hum of machinery outside and the faint crackle of a radio somewhere deeper in the building. The bodies of the fallen enforcers were scattered across the floor, unconscious or groaning in pain. But none of that mattered now. Everything had led to this moment. The Yakuza man struck first. A quick jab, testing the distance, probing for weaknesses. Chuck shifted just slightly, letting the punch pass harmlessly in front of him. The second strike came faster, a sharp hook aimed at his ribs. Chuck blocked it with his forearm, absorbing the impact, feeling the strength behind it. This man was powerful. Then the real fight began. The enforcer moved with precision, his fists a blur as he attacked. Chuck deflected each blow, stepping just outside the reach of the strikes, his instincts honed by decades of training. He wasn't just reacting. He was reading. Every shift in weight, every adjustment in stance told him what was coming next. The Yakuza fighter tried to close the distance, his movements suddenly shifting into something more brutal. A knee shot toward Chuck's midsection, but Chuck caught it, twisting at the last second and forcing the man off balance. He recovered quickly, swinging a heavy elbow toward Chuck's head. Chuck ducked, countering with a sharp strike to the ribs. The enforcer grunted but didn't slow down. They moved across the warehouse floor like two predators locked in a deadly dance. The enforcer was skilled, relentless, but Chuck had fought too many men like him before. Experience had taught him that no matter how good someone was, no one was invincible. Everyone had a weakness. The next strike came high, a feint meant to draw Chuck's guard upward, followed by a low, sweeping kick aimed at his legs. But Chuck wasn't fooled. He stepped over the kick and countered with a lightning-fast strike to the enforcer's shoulder. The man staggered back a step, but his eyes burned with something deeper than anger. Respect. Then he smiled. Chuck barely had time to register the shift before the enforcer reached into his jacket and pulled out a weapon. Not a gun. A knife. A long, curved blade with a polished handle, something that had seen its fair share of blood. Chuck exhaled slowly. He had known this would happen. The Yakuza didn't fight fair. The enforcer lunged, the knife slicing through the air in a deadly arc. Chuck moved fast, sidestepping just enough to avoid the blade, feeling the rush of air as it passed within inches of his torso. The next strike came just as quickly, a downward slash aimed for his shoulder. Chuck caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting sharply. The enforcer grunted in pain, but didn't let go. They struggled for control, muscles straining, the knife trembling between them. The enforcer tried to break free, shifting his weight in an attempt to overpower Chuck. But Chuck had already calculated his next move. With a sudden, explosive burst of strength, he shifted his grip using the enforcer's momentum against him. The Yakuza fighter lost balance for a fraction of a second. Just enough. Chuck seized the opening. A sharp elbow strike to the jaw. A quick follow-up, his fist slamming into the enforcer's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground. The enforcer barely had time to recover before Chuck moved in again, his fist striking like a hammer against the man's ribs. A second hit to the solar plexus, knocking the air from his lungs. The enforcer staggered back, coughing, but still standing. Chuck gave him a moment, a chance to stay down, but the Yakuza didn't know when to quit. With a roar, the enforcer charged again, this time going for brute strength over precision. It was a mistake. Chuck sidestepped at the last second, grabbing the man's arm and using his own momentum to send him flying. The enforcer crashed into a stack of crates, the wood splintering on impact. For a moment, there was silence. Then the enforcer tried to push himself up, his breath ragged, his body battered. He looked at Chuck, eyes clouded with pain, but still filled with defiance. Then, finally, he collapsed. The fight was over. Chuck stood over the fallen enforcer, breathing steadily, his pulse barely elevated. He had faced tougher men, more dangerous fights. But this one had been different. This one had been personal. The warehouse was still. The only sounds were the distant calls of seagulls outside and the faint lapping of water against the docks. Chuck looked around, scanning for any signs of reinforcements. None came. The Yakuza had sent their best, and he had put them down. He walked towards the desk where scattered papers still lay from their earlier discussion. He glanced over them, noting shipment schedules, coded messages, business deals written in cryptic shorthand. This was more than just a gang hideout. This was a hub of operations. Then he saw it. A single envelope, separate from the rest. He picked it up, turning it over. Inside was another slip of paper, just like the one they had left for him at the motel. Another address, a final destination. Chuck exhaled. They still weren't done, but neither was he. The rain had started again by the time Chuck Norris reached the final address. It was an old building near the waterfront, a 2-story structure with faded signage that suggested it had once been a seafood processing plant. Now it stood in the dim glow of the city's outskirts, its windows dark, its presence unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Chuck was looking for it. The Yakuza had left him a trail, one that had led him through fights, ambushes, and tests of strength. This was the final step, the place where they had either prepared their final strike or where they would decide to back down. Chuck had no intention of giving them that choice. He parked a block away, keeping his truck in the shadows. The area was quiet. Too quiet. He stepped onto the pavement, the rain tapping against his jacket as he moved toward the building. No obvious guards, no stationed sentries. But that didn't mean he was alone. The Yakuza were never careless. They didn't need to show force when they controlled everything inside. He reached the entrance, his hand resting against the metal door. For a moment, he listened. Inside, muffled voices. 5, maybe 6. The faint clinking of glass, the scrape of chairs. They weren't expecting him. Not yet. He pushed open the door. The room inside was a large, open space, once used for packing shipments, now turned into something else. A meeting room, a gathering point. A wooden table sat in the center, bottles of sake and scattered cigarette trays littering its surface. 5 men sat around it, their conversation halting the moment Chuck entered. They didn't react immediately. Their eyes locked onto him, assessing, calculating. One of them, an older man with silver hair slicked back, leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. A door at the back of the room opened, and another man stepped inside. Not just any man. The leader. the one who had orchestrated everything. He was taller than the others, dressed in a tailored black suit, his presence commanding. Unlike his enforcers, he wasn't armed, at least not visibly. He didn't need to be. His power wasn't in weapons, it was in the way the others looked at him, the way they sat straighter when he entered, the way the entire room shifted around him. He walked to the table, poured himself a drink, and took a slow sip. Then he looked at Chuck. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, finally, the leader spoke. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of a man who was used to being listened to. Chuck understood Japanese well enough to follow. The leader wasn't angry. He wasn't issuing threats. Instead, he was stating a fact. Chuck had won. The Yakuza didn't operate on reckless pride. They didn't throw men away without reason. Chuck had faced their enforcers, fought their best, and he was still standing. That meant something. The leader motioned to one of the men at the table. A brief conversation, then a slow nod. The decision had been made. Chuck wasn't their enemy, not anymore. The leader reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper and placed it on the table. Then he pushed it toward Chuck. A name, an answer. The reason this had all started. Chuck glanced down at the paper, reading the characters printed neatly in black ink. It wasn't a warning, not another challenge. It was the name of someone from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years, someone who had dragged him into this without him ever knowing. He exhaled. This wasn't over, not completely, but for now the war was done. Chuck looked back at the leader, held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one moved. The Yakuza had made their choice. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the blood that had been spilled over the past few days. The city stretched out before him, quiet, waiting. He stepped into his truck, turned the key, and let the engine rumble to life. The road was ahead of him once more, and as always, he kept moving forward. Make sure to subscribe for more action-packed stories. Share this video with your friends and check out our other videos for more thrilling content. See you in the next one.